My tool belt at that time was essentially putting them in a room or sending them home. And none of that was helping me build a better relationship with them, finding the underlying needs of that child, finding the resources that they needed. All it was creating this mistrust of, hey, this dude doesn't want me at the school. He doesn't want to build a relationship with me.
This is the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with your host, Vicki Davis.
I'm so excited today. We're talking with Joshua Stanford. He has an awesome podcast, Aspire to Learn, and his latest book that he has co-authored is The Language of Behavior. So Josh, how do you channel your personal experience as a struggling student into helping kids today?
Yeah, for me, when I was growing up, I just didn't see the point. I just was mandated to be there. I had a bunch of adults telling me to sit down and shut up and not move. And that was just not conducive for me as a human being. I really only went to school for two things, for athletics and for art. What's funny enough is as I got older, I went back to education, and that's exactly what I did. I became an art teacher and a coach of all things. So because I was making a difference with kids, I had an administrator touch me on the shoulder and be like, hey, I really think you should look into becoming a principal someday. And then as an administrator, I saw that the role is very different, and the things that I really didn't understand about student behavior. And I was using detentions, in school suspension, out of school suspension constantly. And that's where I kind of got in this crossroads of realizing I just didn't feel very effective and almost stepped away from education altogether because I was working with kids that wasn't really helping them at all.
So you started digging into what does work. So when you see a little Josh in that seat, what do you do differently now that you've gone through this journey of really studying what works?
So honestly, we were kind of going through a crossroads at home too. My wife and I decided to become foster parents. And so for anyone that knows that journey, they make you do a lot of training. So during the training, I actually was going through classes with Professor Purvis over at TCU. And she was talking about trauma responsive care. And the behaviors that she was talking about with the foster children were verbatim what I was seeing on the campus. However, the strategies that she was using with them was far different than what I was doing. Mine was obviously very punitive. It was all about fear. It was all about control. And there was more about the relationship and getting to know the student underlying that. And also, of course, building trust between the foster parent and the foster child. So I came back to my campus and I was like, look, I can show you plenty of data where the infractions are only increasing and we're doing the same thing. We're not changing anything. Can we please look at something else? It was frustrated and I knew we had to do something different. So as far as looking at kids like myself, that happened every day. But the thing is my tool belt at that time was three things, right? It was essentially putting them in a room or sending them home. And none of that was helping me build a better relationship with them, finding the underlying needs of that child, finding the resources that they needed. All it was creating this mistrust of, hey, this dude doesn't want me at the school. He doesn't want to build a relationship with me. And he just wants me out and gone somewhere else. And so that's where like the practices changed for us, the mindset changed for us, and I talk about this in the book, which is we created a relationship action team to really like dive into the research and find strategies that we could implement as a starting point. So that way, once it worked, we could make it grow and make it more of a campus culture thing.
Give me an example of how your leadership style changed and how you actually improved behavior.
So the first thing was like just the environment, right? Considering our environment, that's like tenet one for us, which is like, I even looked at my office. I looked at classrooms, like what can we do to make it more inviting? We also started looking at like just how we started our classroom as far as the people that were in the relationship action team, unfortunately called RATS. That group had everyone at the door.
Rats?
I know.
Are you kidding?
I know, RATS. Yeah, it was.
What?
It was a term eventually that turned into affection, but that's not what I anticipated with the acronym. But the RATS group was known for like being at the door, saying hello to every student, side hugs, high fives, making sure we got our names right. We started doing check-ins at the beginning of class. And it was really more of like a proactive piece and mindset versus we're going to wait for a child to misbehave. And then now we have to react and typically default to what we've known as traditional. For me as an administrator, unfortunately, it was like being the sheriff. And I hated that persona of like walking into a classroom and I'm there to like deliver a lunch for a kid. And the whole class is like, ooh, who are you here for? Who's in trouble? And it's like, that's not what I want for myself as an administrator and for the being the AP. So like for me, making sure that I knew every kid on the campus and I had touch points and had positive interactions with them. And then also like if a kid got in trouble, it's not like we're diving into the consequences right now, making you feel like a terrible child. It's more about like getting to know them right away and asking them about themselves. And for myself too, considering that environment, they're in fluorescent lights and white walls, and that's not conducive for them. So like for myself, I was like, okay, what would I want as a kid? And so I like to go outside. So that's what I started to do. As an administrator, I would bring a kid outside and we walk the building to just have a conversation about who they are. And I don't know you very well. Can you tell me about yourself? And get to a personal level before then we got into what were you struggling with? And then why were we escalating to that behavior, kind of getting to the root of the cause and getting them to deflate. Because it's a lot of times, especially in the principal's office, that's where fear is and lies and survival mode, like get them out to a safe space.
So one thing I always say is you have to relate to educate. We got to have those relationships. I know for me as a teacher, my personal goal is that first email home is going to be something positive.
Mm-hmm.
So your book is The Language of Behavior, and it's about trauma responsive strategies. I mean, we have wildfires, we have hurricanes and bad weather, we have political turmoil, we have turmoil at home, we have school violence. Everybody has trauma. Teachers have trauma. Kids have trauma, like it's everywhere. When you're doing behavior strategies, do you just like shift into a different mode with trauma responsive? Or is trauma responsive what you do with everyone?
Majority of people have at least one form of trauma. Before the pandemic, it was already at 70% of people across the world had at least one form of trauma. A lot of teachers right now will tell you students are different now after the pandemic. And we can see why. I mean, so as far as, educators, we just have to be in tune with that and understand that, when I was talking about that tool belt and the strategies that we're using, it needs to be for everybody. The day that you could just yell at a kid for running the hall to stop is over. That's not effective. And you're going to get a negative response. So knowing that, what are some things that we can do in our way of communication, our body language, our environment, and then also just responding intentionally when they are making a poor behavior. Because as we know, they're kids. They're going to make a poor decision throughout their day, throughout the year. It's going to happen at least one point. So what are we going to do as far as the educators to teach the behavior and then restore what has been broken?
Okay, so I was teaching something very important on Friday, and it was a class conversation. I had every kid but one engaged. Well, I just kind of walk over to that side of the room to see, okay, why is this kid who's really bright not engaged? Okay, he was looking at a basketball. Okay, it's like, why is this bright child doing this? So the way I handled it is I said, student, unacceptable, lid down, engage in the conversation. You and I'll talk after class. Because I didn't want to let that ruin my whole class. Because if you give kids in the audience, never goes well. Always handle privately. And one of my personal strategies is, okay, I don't know why you did that because this is not you. I refuse to believe this is you. You are always engaged. You are always with things. Is something going on that would cause you to behave in a way that's not you? Because I think labeling is probably one of the most harmful things that we can do as educators. But do you have any like soapbox that you get on, kind of like I just did, about like, let's don't do that. Let's do this.
Yeah, I think for me, it's like, let's keep the kid in class, especially on like minor infractions, like for what you're saying. When I first started becoming an administrator, like the first thing that I realized, like the first 2 weeks of school was I had a line outside my door, and every student I talked to, it was something minor. It was something that was a disruption, or, a teacher thought they were being disrespectful in their communication, or something like what you just said, just off task and doing something they weren't supposed to. And it was just like kicked out of class. And then I started to like look at the data and start adding it up. And it was literally thousands of minutes of students that were just missing instruction with the expert that's supposed to be teaching them. We're talking about practical tools. We implemented a thing called a push-in model. And what it is where a teacher has something like you had, right, Vicky, where you're like, you know what? This kid's doing something completely different. There's something underlying there, and I want to have a conversation, but I don't want to do it with the peers around and even whispering. Maybe, other people might hear, and I want to make sure that there's a safe space. Well, push-in model is you just call the front office and be like, hey, I would like to push in maybe a counselor, administrator, a coach, someone that's able to come and relieve you for just a couple minutes, maybe 3 to 5 minutes, where you can step out with the child, have a conversation and say, like right away, hey, buddy, what's going on? This is not normal. This is something's different here. And allowing that student to get out of that environment, know that you care about them at a human level, and that you want to assist and potentially provide resources on what's going on. But just giving a little bit of time of one-on-one, so that way the teacher's not sending it to someone else and then feeling, you know what, I have a broken relationship now. I don't know what's going on. Now I'm relying on another teacher, another administrator to give me that information. Now I have a fractured relationship in addition to the fact that I don't know what's going on and that kid's missed a bunch of time. So it's really just a kind of like a real quick reset to understand what's going on with that child, but then also like reinforce the expectations in the classroom, get a verbal agreement. Hey, are you good to go back in the class and get back to work? Typically it's yes. And now you have strengthened a relationship with that kid and get potentially what that child needs at a relationship at a deeper level.
I love that. Having those conversations, particularly when a child acts out of character, there's always a reason. And I just think of right after the pandemic, so often it would be a tears on the floor moment with the child, just crocodile tears on the floor saying, I don't want to be here. I can't tell you in that year we came back how many times that behavior pointed to the fact that a child didn't want to live. And those were such important referrals. Now, that's not as much the case anymore, thankfully, because that was so hard and led to compassion fatigue and all that. So as we finish up, could you give a motivational pep talk to teachers?
Yeah. Well, the main thing is I want to give people hope. I think people are kind of in despair right now. And if you are focusing on the negative consistently, that's where you're going to fall. And I want folks to understand that they have a lot of power. And I want to give permission in that power, because as a teacher myself, I knew if I sent a kid away, I had no power in that situation at all. I was relying on a counselor. I was relying on an administrator, whoever it might be, right, that I'm putting that child onto because of a variety of reasons. So for me, it's like, hey, I want strategies in my own classroom to make sure that my kids are mine and I have full autonomy of what's going on, right? So I can respond to the situation, and so I'll just say that in regards to like giving it. Now, if there's a fight or something that's really, really major, obviously you got to get other people involved. So make sure that you're sticking to, your protocols. But for me with teachers, I just want to give permission to say like, hey, you got a lot of power. And the same thing with administrators. If there's an administrator listening, like you don't have to suspend a kid. You don't have to send them home. And I say that because I've done that myself. And there's been a lot of like very creative, and we don't have time to get into it, but as far as consequences go, consequences have a very large umbrella of what that looks like. And honestly, what we're here to do is to teach, not just to teach subjects. It's great. Yes, math, science, and all that. We're also teaching behavior. We're also teaching executive functioning. We're also teaching about emotional regulation and how to be an adult moving forward. So how are we doing that? And so the same old traditional practices need to go away. We don't live in the same world. We've already established that. So if we're living in a different world, we also need to have different practices and things that we're setting up on the classroom and for the school and the campus. So I want to give you hope. I want to give you power. And I want to make sure that I'm giving you permission to change what you're doing.
The book is The Language of Behavior, written by Joshua Stamper and Charlie Peck. There is hope. You can reduce those office referrals. You can have better classroom management, and you don't have to just suspend kids all the time. That's not something you have to do. Thanks for tuning in to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. Watch the video version of this podcast and catch my new radio and TV show, Cool Cat Teacher Talk, on YouTube and a radio or TV station near you. Join my Cool Cat Teacher Classroom Matters newsletter at coolcatteacher.com/newsletter. Leave a review if you found this helpful. See you later, educator.